People of Reddit who've encountered serial killers before they were caught. What is your story and how did you find out who they were? 1. I have a Bernardo story. One morning I met up with one of my friends, who we'll call Lucky, at school, and she mentions that she thinks some blonde guy in a shitty white cream-colored car was following her as she walked to school. We agree the situation is weird and make plans to walk home together. Safety in numbers and all that. The next day Lucky tells me that when she got home from school the previous afternoon she told her mom about the car. Her mom then tells her that a blonde man came to the door around lunchtime claiming to have lost his dog, and if she, Lucky's mom, had seen it in the neighborhood. She politely told him she hadn't been outside that day, wished him luck and closed the door. Sometime later, I can't remember how long, Paul Bernardo's face is plastered all over the news and both Lucky and her mom confirm that he was the same man that followed Lucky and lost his dog. He was fucking stalking her. 2. One of my tutors at university seemed to have a very short temper. First tutorial session was okay, but he spent 5 minutes telling us how important attending his tutorials was. Tutorials are kind of viewed as optional, as they're to go over stuff covered in the lectures. Second tutorial, a few people didn't show up and he spent 15 minutes ranting about their absence. Third tutorial, even more people didn't turn up, and he spent even longer ranting about it. After that, my friends and I decided it wasn't worth the hassle. Apparently he ranted about the absentees even more at the next tutorial, and I'm not sure if anyone managed to stick out the whole term of tutorials. He'd also help out in lab sessions and various other course-related activities, but everyone found him slightly uncomfortable to deal with. After the exams we had a bit of a party at someone's house to celebrate. A casual invite was extended to the lecturers, tutors and assistants who'd been involved in getting us through the year. He turned up, none of the other teaching staff did, and although not entirely welcome, hung around for a while. When things were winding down, I headed off, but when I spoke to the host of the party the next day, it turned out that Mr. Angry Tutor had ended up crashing on the living room floor with a load of the others, except they'd all arranged in advance to stay over, but had headed off about 5:30 in the morning. We commented on how odd he was, but didn't give it much more thought. Until a few months later, when he was arrested for a violent murder involving dismemberment. He turned out to have a history of violence, and a lot of predatory and stalkerish behaviors. None of that, he was a quiet man, kept himself to himself business. He had obvious anger issues and made people uncomfortable, and it didn't come as a complete surprise to find out how twisted he was. TLDR, odd and angry university tutor turns out to be violent murderer. Edit. I'm reluctant to actually reveal who he is. He's still alive, in prison, and has continued to make a nuisance of himself with various legal challenges whilst incarcerated. If you want a clue, this happened in Bonnie, Scotland, about 20 years ago. 3. My high school girlfriend's dad ended up being a murderer but not a serial killer. His persona was basically cool dad. He'd let my friends and I hang out at their house, didn't bat an eye that I stayed there when he and her mom went out of town, made drinks for us, etc. But he also had a hard, sometimes sleazy, and definitely risk-seeking edge. His wife ran a daycare and he kept between 10 and 15 loaded firearms in the house, and at one point, when he'd had a few drinks too many, he asked me how his daughter was, with a knowing smirk. 5 or so years later her mom had divorced him for being abusive and he'd remarried someone much younger and had a daughter with her. He made the news for unloading a clip into his new wife, reloading, and then unloading the second clip as well. He then put their infant child in the car, drove to the nearest airport, left the infant at the curb and hopped the first flight he could to Europe. He was eventually extradited back and, I think, is now serving a life sentence, but only after the district attorney agreed to drop the death penalty. Looking back, the only really spooky moment was when her mom caught us in bed together. They were home and we were decent, but she was really frantic about getting me into the guest room before he found us and freaked out. Something about the way she used that phrase suggested it would be a lot worse than just yelling. The dissonance of her reaction and the questions about his daughter and my sex life was what stuck with me, like he was asking a question to justify a rage. 4. I work with a guy who is a sadistic sociopath and absolutely going to be a serial killer one day. Over the past 2 years he's been escalating his violence against women, assaults, rapes, breaking into their houses to assault them, fraud, emptying their bank accounts, pathological lying to everyone. He'll put on the charm to attract a girlfriend and then systemically increase his abuse until they have a breakdown, usually working 2-3 targets at a time, some online while others are in person. He managed to pull off a catfish marriage, and when the poor girl showed up he beat her, threw out her family heirlooms, sold her stuff on eBay, took her car keys, emptied her bank accounts and maxed out her credit cards, line of credit, told her one day she didn't live there anymore and if she came back from work that night he'd have her arrested as a trespasser. And then fucking did it. He had already started seeing his next girlfriend when she first arrived to move in. She had to move to the other side of the country after 3 months. He would go on to rape another girl, who reported it, and he then stalked and threatened her until she had a breakdown, eventually breaking into her house to assault her again. Although he is facing charges for the breaches and B&E, nothing has stopped him at all. He's moving on to new victims now, Convinced the upcoming trial is all a plot by police because they are jealous of him and he's innocent. His kids are right fucked up too. CPS must have a dozen files on him, and somehow they get to stay in that house. He's terrible at his job, but this is the military, so he knows if he does just the minimum he won't get booted, at least not until the trials are done with. Eventually, yes, he will go down for what he does, but I can't stand that it won't be until there are many more victims and one of them winds up murdered. I have no doubt it is his goal to kill someone. 5. Not me, but my mother. Back in 1976, my mom worked for the city of Pensacola, Florida, during the graveyard shift. She worked with the computers that did the utility billing and finances. One computer, which handled the utilities, was in the main city hall building, but the finance computer was in the finances office, which was in a separate building across the parking lot. She would have to cross the parking lot frequently to go from one computer to another, as networking as we know it now was just a pipe dream in those days. Nobody parked in the rear parking lot at night. She parked in the front lot. One particular night, there was a VW Beetle parked in the lot that she didn't recognize. She saw the driver of the car sitting behind the wheel. He appeared to be asleep, so she thought nothing of it and headed onto the finance building. She came out of the building an hour later, and he was still there. However, he noticed her as she was coming out of the finance building. He got out of the car and walked towards her. She noticed he had a cast on his arm, like he'd been injured. He was also limping. He called out to her and asked, "Can you come help me with something for a minute?" She had that feeling of dread. Her defenses went up. She said she had to clock back in but would come right back out. She quickly went up the stairs to City Hall, unlocked the door, and got inside just as he had approached the bottom of the stairs. She locked the door back. When she looked out the window in the door back at him, something seemed off about him. He had this sinister glare on his face. He seemed to catch himself and reset his facial muscles into a more relaxed state and gave a big friendly smile. He just waved at her and said, "Take your time, I'll wait." She got to a phone, called the sheriff's office, and reported a suspicious person outside of the City Hall building in the back parking lot. She asked if they could escort her to the other building and make him leave. They obliged, and within a few minutes a deputy arrived to the front door. They went out the back, and when the guy saw my mom coming out with the sheriff's deputy, he hauled ass out of there. The next day, that same VW was pulled over at a nearby popular restaurant known for their pancakes, local place, not IHOP, for running a stop sign. And that's how my mom, one of only 2 women who got away from Ted Bundy. 6. When I was about 12, in the 90s, a nice chap that lived on our neighborhood would sometimes hang out with us teenagers. He was about 50 at the time and worked for a local paper writing on social events. He usually would tell us histories from the dictatorship era here in Brazil and some from his early life on the stage. I guess he was not a serial, but simply a killer. A few years later we discovered that he was been prosecuted for the murder of his first wife. Sometime during the 70s or 80s, he requested a divorce and she denied. A few months later they agreed to try to sort things out, going to a romantic trip at a desert beach. Well, he strangled and buried her, thinking no one was watching them. The fact is that a lone fisherman saw the whole thing, but as far as I remember, was either too afraid or distant to help. Sometime afterwards, the fisherman was able to dig her out, but she was already dead. The autopsy found a few pounds of beach sand in her lungs, meaning she was buried alive. This guy never showed any signs of being a killer, and was actually quite funny at the time. Eventually he was arrested, but sometime later was moved to a prison hospital due to poor health and escaped after a few days. He passed away after a couple years, and I'm pretty sure he did not spend even a whole year in prison. What scares me? Our total inability to recognize him as a killer/psycho. Not even a hint. 7. Apparently my family just draws killers to them. My aunt when she was young was in Florida on vacation. She was walking through a parking lot between a car and a van, and the van opened its door and snagged her. Some crazy things happened I don't think need discussed, and somehow she ended up escaping. Turns out this guy was abducting a lot of women in the area, but my aunt was the first one who survived. She still suffers PTSD from it. I've never asked what his name was or anything, don't want to bring up bad memories. There was a guy who used to be known as a real hard ass. Ended up getting mad at his wife over something, took her to his pole barn, killed her, chopped her up, put her in a barrel, took her down by the river and burned her. After he was done he went to my grandpa's house on his 3-wheeler with his girlfriend to eat beans with my gramps. When my grandpa was alive and he cooked beans, he would cook a huge cast iron pot full of them over a fire starting at about 6 a.m. that morning. They were delicious and everyone would come over to have a couple bowls of his amazing beans, so it wasn't uncommon for random people to show up. My grandpa said he acted completely normal and never mentioned anything about his wife. There is an episode of CSI based off this murder too. They cut open the tree to see how long ago a fire happened near the tree or something along those lines. Not a serial killer, but worth mentioning. Edit. Fred Grab was the name of the guy who killed his wife, and it was turned into a TV show for Forensic Files. Not CSI. 8. During a family get-together some years back, my second cousins start talking about their 40th high school reunion. They bust out the pictures that show themselves sitting next to this friendly-looking guy. The area had been on edge again, this with a serial killer's letters detailing some murders showing up at the cop shop. As it turns out, they graduated in the same class as Dennis Rader, the park official, who dubbed himself BTK. My cousin said he was a friendly and sociable man, a little awkward but disarming. It was not long after the reunion his arrest made national headlines for his 30-year killing spree. On another note, a quick Google search a few months back turned up that a childhood playmate is serving 35 to life for gun, drug and burglary charges. This came as less of a surprise to me.
Thanks for watching. If you got this far, leave a comment, like if you liked it, and follow for more.